Hey, we're at the top of the hour, 2 o'clock, so we'll move straight into our next panel because we've got an abundance of riches with this AVERT Research Network Symposium. Just one great panel and speaker after another, and I don't want to take up their time. So I'll introduce, first of all, Adjunct Professor Jacob Ware, and then later on I'll introduce Dr. Joshua Roose. Adjunct Professor Jacob Ware is an adjunct professor at the Center for Jewish Civilization at Georgetown University's Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service, which I think most of you will realize is well known to us because of Bruce Hoffman and his long career and contribution there. Like Bruce, Jacob teaches on domestic terrorism and the international far right, and particularly of importance here, male supremacist extremist movements. And he holds master's degrees from Georgetown's security program. And he's going to be speaking to us about the threat of incel violence, which is incel terrorist violence, which is something we hear a lot about, but we're still trying to unpack. So it's great to have you unpacking this for us, Jacob. Of course, we first began talking about this maybe 7 years ago in 2014. It has increased in its impact in terms of copycat attacks. But what are the trends underlying the movement, and where is it going, or what are we likely to see coming up in future? So Jacob's going to give us the answers to all those questions. Thank you very much, Jacob. And I should say it's 11 p.m. in Washington, D.C., so thank you for staying up so late and joining us. We really appreciate it.
No worries at all. Thank you so much for having me. It's a great honor to be part of this conference, and especially having seen the program, it looks absolutely incredible. I'll join for as much as I can over the next few days. As Greg said, my name is Jacob Ware. I'm an adjunct professor at Georgetown University in the School of Foreign Service, where I teach a class on domestic terrorism. We spend a lot of time, obviously, in that class on white supremacist movements, but we also spend a chunk on male supremacist violence, specifically incel movement, which I'm going to talk about today. So just three quick things before I start. The first is I'm going to give some background on the movement, talk a bit about some of the acts of violence that we've seen. But other than that, I tend to assume at this point that there's a base of knowledge in the virtual room about this movement. So I want to try and be forward thinking and think about some of the trends that we've seen, or that we are seeing right now, that we'll see over the next 5 to 10 years, some of the big questions we're dealing with, and to talk a bit about the impact of the pandemic as well. So I'll try and be forward thinking. The other thing is I'd like to try and keep it short if I can, because I have found in my discussions and presentations I've given about incels, typically they tend to lead to quite a vibrant Q&A portion, and I want to make sure we leave plenty of time for that. So I'll keep it short. And then thirdly, just to repeat the obvious, I am here in Washington, D.C. It's 11 p.m. So I apologize in advance for any tiredness. I promise I'm really excited to be here. I'm very excited for hopefully a good discussion towards the end of our hour together. So yeah, apologies in advance. So just to give some quick background before we really get into the trends, the incel ideology is based on the concept of involuntary celibacy. Effectively, the idea that there are certain physical, biological, social, mental, cultural characteristics that are preventing certain men from having access to some kind of sexual marketplace. That marketplace, they claim, is dominated by so-called Chads and Stacys, who effectively are the idealized sexually promiscuous men and women, who incels claim are excluding them from participating from that marketplace. The result then is an embittered community of male forum dwellers who perceive themselves to be social outcasts, sexual outcasts, and who turn their ire against mostly women, but also men, as well as the idea of the romantic couple. We've seen a number of incidents, major incidents linked to this ideology over the years, especially in North America. In 2014, 22-year-old Elliot Rodger stabbed his 3 male roommates to death before opening fire at a sorority house nearby on the campus of the University of California, Santa Barbara in Isla Vista, California. 6 people were killed before he took his own life. And he had released a manifesto and videos online outlining his ideology. In 2018, we had the deadliest incel attack to date. 25-year-old Alec Manassian drove his rented van down Yonge Street in Toronto in Canada, killing 10 people. He had pledged allegiance to the movement on Facebook. And then later that year, an individual opened fire at a yoga studio in Tallahassee in Florida, killing 2 people. He had released several videos and songs over the years praising the movement. We have also seen several mass shootings at US high schools and colleges by gunmen who echo aspects of this ideology. In my mind, these are a bit more difficult to link directly to the movement because you don't necessarily have a gunman or an attacker who directly kind of cites the ideology, but it nevertheless indicates that elements of the ideology are serving to inspire even those who are not necessarily active members of the subculture. So on an increasingly complex domestic terrorism and extremism stage, incels seem to occupy a curious space. They don't seem to pose the same threat as white supremacists and Salafi jihadists, but they certainly inflame fear and they spark intense discussion. They're often quite bizarre. Creed transcends assumed ideological boundaries. For example, a far-right extremist attacked a synagogue and kebab shop in Germany a couple of years ago. He had repeated several tropes that were common on incel chat rooms. So regardless of how we understand them ideologically, violent elements of the incel movements do retain a terrorism threat against Western communities. And as we approach the end, hopefully the end of the pandemic, we've seen a number of trends emerge within this movement and in the terrorism and counterterrorism space that bear watching. And I've picked out 5 trends for us to look at today. So firstly, 2020 and 2021 were actually pretty bad years for incel violence. Shortly after a 22-year-old gunman opened fire and murdered 5 people on the streets of Plymouth on Britain's southern coast in August, news reports emerged linking him to the obscure, largely online incel movement. Women are arrogant and entitled beyond belief, the killer had posted on social media shortly before the attack, and described himself as bitter and jealous, seemingly confirming his allegiance to the movement. That was the deadliest incident we've seen in the past 2 years. It killed 5 people, not including the gunman. But incidents in the US and Canada in the past 2 years have also provided reminders of the threat to North America and claimed victims. The most serious US case was one Arizona-based incel who opened fire at a shopping mall in Glendale in May 2020, shortly after the reopenings, looking to kill couples, 5 couples specifically. 3 people were wounded. In Toronto, again, a teenager was charged with a terrorism crime, having murdered a woman at a massage parlor. And in Virginia, an individual blew his hand off building a bomb that he was going to use to kill cheerleaders. Counterterrorism analysts often reference the nexus between intent and capability. Where they meet, terrorism is more likely, often inevitable. With incels, intent often outpaces capability. In other words, they might have a desire to do something without the means to do so. And the only reason the violence hasn't been worse, or at least more visible in the past 2 years, has been incompetence on the part of the attackers, but also good policing. But crucially, it's not due to a lack of intent. And as long as the intent persists, we are at threat. So any narrative that you read that says that the violent elements of this movement have moderated their deadly intentions are wrong. Secondly, and more than likely relatedly, profound pandemic-related concerns about radicalization to extremism may prove disproportionately true in the incel case study. I understand that you had a discussion on this morning, your time, I guess. I wasn't able to join, but I imagine that the panelists said something along the lines of, experts are quite concerned about the fact that the same difficulties and troubles that we've all experienced over the past 2 years, ranging from isolation, loneliness, boredom, too much time spent online, too much time wrestling with really difficult, big questions in the world, that those things are going to feed extremism. Now, of course, those are possible factors in extremism to all radicalization to all ideologies. And so over the past 18 months, we've all kind of been given a snapshot of what life is like in radical movements, sometimes by choice in those movements, sometimes by necessity. I would argue that the reason why the pandemic is so dangerous specifically for incel radicalization is because, unlike with some of those other extremist movements, those factors I discussed, the isolation, loneliness, boredom, too much time online, with incels, those factors are actually part of the ideology itself. Incels are radicalized online. They talk incessantly about being alone, a lack of friends, romantic prospects, about spending day after day at home alone, about trouble they're having in school, about trouble they're having finding work. Early in the pandemic, some incels actually celebrated the lockdowns because they effectively said, now you know what it's like to be me. Now you know what it's like to be alone. Now you know what it's like to be incel. But then the lockdowns lifted, and then the incels were left alone again, and they are at home watching old classmates, maybe old crushes, get back to normal life. And that makes for a volatile combination. Misogyny and sexual frustration, those are hugely important parts of this movement. But we must also recognize that incel ideology and the incel movement is self-reinforcing. You spend more time at home alone, you isolate yourself more from society. And those feelings, emotions, conditions that lead incels into radicalization in the first place, they've actually only intensified over the past 2 years. Just to take a quick detour on this point, one key element of the incel ideology is the so-called black pill. Now, those of you who have watched The Matrix know that if you take the blue pill, you'll continue to live in a world of illusion. If you take the red pill, you'll be exposed to the world's fundamental truths. Incels also perceive or claim to take a black pill. The black pill basically says that the conditions of inceldom are unchangeable, that incels are therefore predetermined to live as incels forever. This nihilistic viewpoint of the world and their place in it is exactly what makes incels so dangerous. I'll quote the Plymouth gunman. He said, "I personally don't think once you live this life, you can really ever change the damage done. I personally believe my scars and damage will follow me forever." The end result then is that most acts of incel violence are actually murder-suicides. Like in Plymouth, violent incels often aim to end their own lives while simply maximizing the number of people they take with them. So any societal condition, any place, any time in the world where isolation increases, loneliness increases, depression increases, those are naturally going to lead to rising radicalization and possibly violence from the incel movement. So you're going to hear a lot of theories these next few days about the impact of the pandemic on radicalization writ large. I would argue that the incel case is actually one of the case studies which is going to determine whether or not those theories prove to be true or not. Thirdly, we are seeing an expansion to Europe. Most incel violence has been contained to North America, as I explained earlier, but multiple arrests in the past few years in Scotland and England were followed by that tragedy in Plymouth in August, while Germany and Italy have also witnessed incels mobilizing towards violence, whether successfully or not. Incels represent one of the ultimate case studies in an ongoing trend that we're seeing in terrorism, where movements that were previously assumed to be largely domestic are actually crossing borders and oceans, accelerating along social media lines to radicalize newcomers in new countries. I argue this makes them far more difficult to challenge because they have they begin to evade any of the traditional conceptualizations employed by national counterterrorism agencies and their strategies. And this trend may intensify as social media continues to be the front line of radicalization and terrorism. To be clear, there's nothing inherently Western about incel ideology that would prevent it from expanding further, for example, say to Asia. On that note, I also want to touch briefly on the Australia question. I should note that I'm a US-based researcher who studied the movement primarily as a North American-based movement that has had the potential to spread elsewhere. So I am not an expert on incel violence or incel radicalization or even incel organization in Australia. My understanding, although I'm perfectly happy to be, or dismayed is probably the better word if I'm proven wrong, is that Australia has not had an active incel violence within its borders. I also am not sure if there's actually been an arrest of an incel for plotting an act of violence in Australia. But just to repeat myself one more time very clearly, I don't see any reasons why the incel ideology would not take root in Australia too. For more on the specific question of the incel threat to Australia, I point you all in the direction of an excellent paper published in the Australian Journal of Political Science in May 2020 by 3 scholars from the University of Western Australia. Fourthly, incels have attracted a lot of media and counter-terrorism attention, partly because of the acts of violence that we've seen. But there are other misogynist movements that are just as dangerous, and we risk ignoring them with too much focus on just the quote-unquote incel threat. I believe this is precisely what Dr. Roose is going to discuss in his remarks that follow mine, which I was very pleased to see. So I won't spend too much time on this point. The most clear example is the Atlanta shooting in the US, in Atlanta, Georgia, early this year, during which women were targeted at multiple Asian majority spas. That attacker was not an incel. His ideology has been a little bit hard to place, but he similarly combined deeply personal, deeply sexual grievances with an ideology that justified violence against an outgroup, which in this case also included a racial dimension. So the importance of tackling broader misogyny and male supremacism writ large should not be missed while our focus is on incel specifically. Fifth, and my final point, and perhaps more interesting to those of us who are more focused on countering this movement, there are ongoing debates about how to push back against the violence, particularly about efforts to combat it as a quote-unquote terrorist ideology. Canada, in particular, has led the effort to classify incel violence as quote-unquote terrorism, with the aforementioned Toronto case, which involved the first terrorism charge worldwide for an incel-inspired attack, inspiring passionate debate on the topic. The US appears to be following suit, but far more cautiously. This, to me, is one of the major million-dollar questions in efforts to counter incel violence. Does calling it terrorism help or hurt? Is that the natural, necessary next step? What are the possible downsides of securitizing the incel movement and the violence it poses? Importantly, those questions are complicated by the fact that not all acts of incel-inspired violence involve equal ideological components. Again, here Plymouth provides a worthwhile case study. The first recognized incel attack, which I discussed earlier, targeted a sorority house in Isla Vista, California, and involved a gunman who published a manifesto and videos online explicitly claiming credit for his attack and linking it directly to the ideology. The Plymouth shooting didn't have that. The word terrorism and the legal ramifications that might or might not accompany it should be reserved for ideological violence that clearly targets a defined outgroup and aims to spread psychological fear, a standard that does not fit every act of violence linked to incels, including the attack in Plymouth, although it certainly does meet some. In summary, then, very quickly, we face a male supremacist movement producing extremists who are as emboldened to attack as ever, who will benefit from the pandemic, are expanding to Europe, and are actually just one of many male supremacist subsects. On the post-COVID counterterrorism stage, then, incels may play a leading role, including in Australia. Happy to take any questions at the end. Thank you.
Excellent. That's really great, Jacob. It's tempting to dive in now with some questions, but I won't. I'll pass straight on to Josh. And as you said, it's great to have you and Josh speaking back to back. So Dr. Joshua Roose is at the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalisation at Deakin University, and he has spent many years researching terrorism, domestic terrorism included, but particularly the aspect of toxic masculinity, both within far-right extremism and other kinds of terrorism, and the way in which male supremacism sometimes overlaps with white supremacism and anti-feminist, anti-misogynist positions. So after that brilliant paper by Jacob Ware, we're now going to hear Josh speak about the threat of male supremacist violent extremism and terrorism, and whether we can talk about a new paradigm. So I'm sure there's going to be a lot of discussion, a lot of questions, but straight to you, Josh. Thanks very much, and thank you, Jacob.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. Appreciate that, and thanks, Jacob. Obviously, your work, in particular in the studies in conflict and terrorism, is particularly pivotal to the space, and a really important contribution. I'm just going to quickly acknowledge that I'm working on a paper in this space with Dr. Joanna Cook over at ICCT/Leiden, and acknowledge some of the ideas that she's had gone into this as well. Okay. I've got a lot of slides to get through in 20 minutes. I may skip over some, including the incel work that I've done, primarily because it's just been covered quite well. But I do want to give some background to the paper and some ideas on why we're at this moment. I want to talk briefly about the manosphere and the red pill, and some of the terminology. I want to talk about the legislative approaches with a focus on Canada and Canada and Australia in particular. And then I'll talk briefly about the potential prevalence of this in the wider community, and some ideas about how we might spot that. So in terms of the background, if you'd asked us 10 years ago, would we see men's rights groups like Men Going Their Own Way, incels, it would have been pretty hard to fathom. And so the question is, how do we get to this point? I don't have too much time to delve into that, but what we have seen are a wide array of issues creating effectively a perfect storm for this new form of violent extremism and terrorism. We can talk about the impact of the global financial crisis, and its impact not immediately in 2008, 2009, but over a period of 3, 4, and 5 years, in particular in the flyover states in the US, and creating that sort of groundswell of support for Trump that has sort of paralleled the emergence of incel movements in many ways, and male supremacist groups. Obviously, the emergence of social media and social media encrypted messaging apps as well. We have a point where Telegram is a communication mechanism of choice. In 2013, it started with several hundred members. It's now up to 550 million people using it monthly. The decline of traditional institutions that offered a sense of guidance for, in particular, working men. Trade unions offered a sense of solidarity and moral leadership, and churches offered a sense of community and spiritual leadership. Both have been decimated over the last 30 to 40 years. Declining trust in governments, which was covered very amply earlier, neoliberal economics, and the emergence of global right-wing populist movements, in particular demagogic strongmen who seek to effectively beat their chests and talk about reasserting the nation on the world stage and recapturing past glories. And then obviously the emergence of the far right. So it's in this space that we've seen the emergence of male supremacism as a new force, albeit the same old force. Some quotes, I won't read those out, but we must, as Durst Latty argues, recognise gender ideology, in this case male supremacy, as an inherently political ideology. Understanding male supremacy as a political and ideological orientation is key to shifting the public policy and legislative inertia that will very likely result in an increase in violent extremism and terrorist action directed against women and girls on the basis of their gender. So male supremacism may be defined as a gender-based political ideology centred on the principle that men are biologically superior to women and that the laws and institutions of society should reflect this. And there are two primary categories of women to blame for the current state of society. Feminists, who subvert the natural gender order and who are deserving of vitriol, abuse, harassment, and in some cases death. And licentious women who are gold diggers, liars, and whores. The highly sexualized, they talk about the Western woman very often in forums. Women who have sex with everyone but them and who have effectively trapped men into marriage and so on. Male supremacists, like others, are radicalised by political and religious, ideologies, believe they have unique possession of a universal truth and insight. In this case, feminism has subordinated men, subverted the natural sexual order, and that men who have been made victims must reclaim what is rightfully theirs. The core elements are a belief that men are biologically superior, and that's informed by a biological determinism that women's role and females' role is to breed and to tend the house. A belief that the state and its institutions and services are inherently opposed to men. Victimisation is a powerful theme across male supremacist groups as a broad coalition, and I'll talk about that shortly. Male supremacists aim to awaken society to the perceived injustices faced by men, to reassert men's perceived rightful place in society as breadwinners and heads of the households enjoying full sexual access to women that they've been deprived of. Anti-feminism is pretty much central to male supremacism in many respects. It's posited on the existence of a higher order, be it the will of God, human nature, national destiny, or social stability. Feminism is perceived to be the primary causal factor contributing to the oppression of men in institutions and wider society. And feminists are framed as an enemy subverting the natural order. In a lot of earlier sort of work on Muslim communities in the West, they talked about the fifth column, and in many respects, feminists are seen to be the fifth column, undermining societal structures from within. Critically, there's a public sphere focus. We're not talking about domestic terrorism and feminist arguments here about male violence against women in households. We're talking about achieving change in the public sphere. Fifth, the permissibility of the use of violence to achieve change. We see online abuse, harassment, and threats spill over into real-world violence. Now, there's been some interesting work on misogyny being the gateway to the far right, and obviously to that extent, I'm not covering that here, but it's worth looking into as well. Ideological motivation is an important element in defining violent extremism, yet the word itself is often taken for granted. Ideology is a coherent and relatively stable set of beliefs or values that has remained consistent over time. It's a system of, or Hamilton defines it as a system of collectively held normative, reputably factual beliefs and attitudes, advocating a particular pattern of social relationships and arrangements aimed at justifying a particular pattern of conduct, which its proponents seek to promote, realise, pursue, or maintain. So the key question is that these attitudes of feminists and women, aren't they just old-fashioned garden variety sexism? Isn't this just the patriarchy? And I suppose the difference here is that this is politically oriented and it's focused on the public sphere. It's an ideological orientation informing political activism both in the streets and online environments that is increasingly spilling over into ideologically motivated violent extremism and terrorism against women and girls on the basis of their gender. It cuts across far right, alt-right, Islamist, fundamentalist Christian ideological orientations. Australian legislators have been slow to act. Australian law has not, for example, prohibited gendered hate speech. However, there is an increasing recognition that I'll cover in the back end of this presentation amongst security agencies that gender-based terrorism is an increasing global phenomenon. I'll quickly cut across misogyny as a term, and because obviously a key intersecting concept here is violent misogyny. And the etymology of the word misogyny indicates it's derived from the Greek words misos, hatred, and gyne, or woman, and emerged in the mid-17th century. So it predates our contemporary use of the term by centuries. It's defined in its contemporary usage in the Cambridge Dictionary as feelings of hating women, or the belief that men are much better than women. And that's important because it captures the possibilities of male supremacist ideology as both shaping individual animosity and hatred of women, and the externally focused political conviction that men are superior to, and yet victims of, women and feminists, that forms the basis of political action, violent extremism and terrorism. So the point here is that it's been labelled violent misogyny. I would assert that an ideology has to stand for rather than purely against something. So I'll leave that quote with you, but in effect, the manosphere is sort of understood to be defined into 4 areas: men's rights groups, men going their own way, pickup artists, and incels or involuntary celibates. And they believe they have a central belief that feminist values dominate society, and that you have to take this red pill to see the cruel reality and to really deal with your world and its cruel existence around it. So these are looked at separately in a lot of literature. People talk about men's rights groups or parents' rights activists, or there's a huge amount of literature emerging on involuntary celibates. What I'd argue is that in a way, it's much like we used to look at Marxism. Marxism was made up of Trotskyism, Maoism, Leninism. They were all different substrands, but effectively they're still understood under the umbrella of being Marxists and socialists. And so for the purpose of understanding these different groups, you've got to understand them as part of a broader movement. There's a real ideological consistency that it brings them much more closely together than it divides them. I'll very quickly touch on this, but we know that male supremacism online is anti-democratic. It shuts down the space for girls and women to have opinions online. There's a normalisation of extremist political ideas. So an international survey found that Australia was a particular problem, with 65% of teenagers, of young women, being exposed to a spectrum of online violence compared to 58% globally, including violent and insulting language, deliberate embarrassment, and threats of sexual violence. 22%, 1 in 5, feared for their physical safety as a result of online interactions. And I would assert that there's a good dimension of that comes from male supremacist actors or people who subscribe to that ideology in some capacity. Men's rights activists assert that societal institutions, including family courts, are prejudiced by feminist perspectives and actively favour women and mothers over men and fathers. They focus on a range of grievances, including child custody, domestic violence against men by women, circumcision, which they frame as genital mutilation of boys, and male suicide rates. Researchers have identified that MRAs, or men's rights associations and groups, have played a role in mobilising a backlash to feminist anti-rape activism, seeking to frame sexual violence as a gender-neutral problem, asserting that feminists are responsible for the erasure of men's experiences of sexual assault, and that feminism persecutes and denigrates men, taking away their human rights. Research demonstrates that men's rights activists use abuse, threats and harassment to target perceived enemies, in particular feminists. So Paul Elam, the photo here, runs the Centre for Men website and was designated as a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Centre. And he's advocated for a Bash a Violent Bitch month for male victims of domestic violence. Now, again, these have existed for a while, but does this lead to what we could call violent extremism and terrorism? And yes. So the case of Roy Den Hollander in the US demonstrates that men's rights activists have a propensity to acts of violent extremism and terrorism. On the 19th of July 2020, he was a self-described anti-feminist men's rights activist, attacked the home of US federal court judge Esther Salas, seeking to kill her, though instead shooting her son dead and wounding her husband. The attacker was a lawyer, a member of a men's rights association group known as the National Coalition of Men, before he was kicked out, and he had a long history of lawsuits that alleged gender discrimination against men. His attack on the judge was motivated by his belief that Judge Salas was appointed to the bench due to affirmative action, was prejudiced against white men, that intersection with race, and was obstructing a case alleging discrimination against men. It's also the hate crime conviction of James Sears and Leroy St. Germain in Ontario, Canada. The defendants were the editor and publisher of a community newspaper, the Your Ward News, distributed to over 300,000 homes centred in the Beaches neighbourhood of Toronto. And it also had an online readership with a claim of over 1 million readers. They were charged and convicted under section 319(2) of the Criminal Code in Canada with 2 counts of willful promotion of hatred against an identifiable group, Jews and women. And you can see from the content here that this could quite readily escalate to terrorism. Men going their own way. In contrast to collective action advocated by men's rights activists, they focus on individual solutions to what they term gynocentric Western societies. I believe they formed 2 decades ago and have an extensive presence on social media, gained prominence through amplification of their messaging by alt-right figures. And a primary theme that defines people who align with this is revelation. The premise of the movement is to awaken men to the need to reject society, which is framed as giving them the red pill. They reject feminism and advocate the complete rejection of women for anything other than sexual pleasure. Comprehensive analysis of their forums by Australian researchers asserts that the individual focus obfuscates the potential danger of the movement. It's revealed that online harassment by men going their own way actors could be coded by order of frequency as sexual statements, emasculation, anti-feminism, sexual harassment, and violent control. I'm going to skip pickup artists. Rush Valadazo here is since converted to Orthodox Christianity, but in his guise as the leader of one of the pickup artist movements online, advocated the legalisation of rape. And that ties in broadly to the same ideological orientation. So incels have been covered quite amply. I don't want to go into them too much. I suppose what I do want to do though is just quickly frame them in the context of what I'm talking about here, ideological orientation. Sexual frustration is a core trait of incels. They believe that society and sexual access is determined by physical characteristics and that women are superficial beings that only favour attractive men at the top of the hierarchy. There's obviously a number of subcategories of incels, height cells, ethicels, and so on, and not all subscribe to violent extremism. However, going into details of them, which was covered, actually, there you are, Jacob, quoted there. What I want to do here is focus on the quotes and how they actually allude to ideological orientation. Not only is there extreme violence, but he wants to completely abolish sex. Women themselves would have to be abolished. Women must be quarantined like the plague that they are, so they can be used in a manner that actually benefits a civilised society. And I assert that that's a political and ideological orientation to the correct treatment of women. Likewise, of many cases, William Aitchison, who there's a good subcategorisation of incels in that Hoffman Ware article and Shapiro article. Not a first degree, so to speak, incel, but someone who was certainly influenced by the ideas. Women should not be allowed to enter into the military or government, nor should they be allowed to vote. They should be demoted to sex objects sold by their fathers to genetically superior people. Women should be treated like dogs. All women are whores. They should be locked up in cages like the chimps they are. Women do not belong in the realm of politics. Get back in the kitchen. Again, ties in directly to this ideological orientation to where women belong and should be subordinated in society. There's a hatred of feminists. There's a hatred of women that extends well beyond the realms of what we used to call misogyny. Now, I'm aware of timing. I've probably got a minute or two, Greg. I'll just quickly cover off on the legislative approaches that have been taken. Canada's really led the way, and I think it's important that in looking at this, yep, I'll take the cough as a hint. But in effect, we need to look at what is happening in Canada. In particular, the fact that they've identified 4 categories of issue-motivated violent extremism, of which gender-driven violence, including violent misogyny, and that includes incel and anti-LGBTQ violence, is identified. Gender-driven violence is defined as the hatred of those of a different gender or sexual orientation, which can lead to violent misogyny. And they're prosecuting a terrorism trial, RV Minor, which actually is directly related to the very first prosecution that I'm aware of someone with incel ideological motivation. They've taken the hard way. They could have charged this guy with murder, but they're actually attempting to prosecute it as a terrorism offence, which is critical, and we need to keep an eye on that. In Australia, ASIO have identified that, or they've adopted the religiously motivated, ideologically motivated categories, but they also refer to violent misogynists who adhere to incel ideology. I assert again that it needs to extend from incel ideology to male supremacist ideologies. The prevalence, very quickly, we see up at the table 4.1, 1 in 5 men 18 to 34 disagree strongly with the idea that women deserve equal rights to men. Almost 6%. And the rights for women have gone too far. It's actually more than 1 in 3 at 37%. So to talk about embeddedness, as in the last presentation, this is actually embedded in wider society, and it's got to be dug out by the roots, and that's obviously part of the problem. Just to go back over the main elements: distrust of political institutions is bias against men, extreme anti-feminism, references to victimisation of men, natural gender order, the sexualisation of women, and there's also a new body of work being done on there, possible links to paedophilia, sadomasochistic porn and rape. All right, that's it from me. Thank you.
Thanks, Josh. You packed an awful lot in there. That's a great amount of rich information to digest. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions. There's one come through directly, though. We start with that, directed to Josh, but I think Jacob too, if you wish to engage with this. A lot of male supremacist discourse uses similar tropes to those used by racist ethno-supremacists, so white supremacists, and particularly the ugly language talking about women, dogs, whores, should be locked in cages, etc. What are the crossovers between white supremacism or other kinds of ethno-supremacism and gender-based supremacism, male supremacism? And I think both of you would be able to make some really valuable responses to that.
I'll jump in first quickly. I mean, this ties in strongly. There is a strong intersection with white nationalist ideologies and extremisms. This idea that part of the problem of white societies, as they see them, is that women have moved out of the home and taken jobs and evolved from their role as effectively being there to breed. And so part of the problem is that one of the first sort of challenges for them is to get women back into the home. But that ties into this broader narrative of, or issue, I suppose, of working men, be it blue collar or white collar, feeling displaced from the economy and displaced from opportunities. And so to them, it ties into that broader issue of their sense of alienation and marginalisation and frustration. But that's not just not Western societies. I mean, we see this in India. In fact, there's a strong men's rights activist community in India. This idea of involuntary celibacy is going to be a significant issue where there's shortages of women in the wider population as well across Asia. But we see it in India, we see it in the language of Bolsonaro, we see it in the language of Duterte. Women are there to be used for sex and belong in the home, and so on. So there are intersections with hard right ideologies and populism, but there are also committed, this is a standalone ideological orientation that can also be looked at as a direct and explicit form of violent extremism and terrorism. Jacob?
Thanks, Josh. Jacob?
I think that's a great answer. I'll just add in one point. Yes, there's absolutely strong overlap. One place we see a lot of overlap in my mind is the radicalization patterns that we see and also the profiles that we see. So typically with both the far right, at least the neo-Nazi violence we've seen recently, as well as with the incels, is we typically see this with, it's typically young men, obviously young white men, radicalized online. And in addition to some of the things that Josh spoke about, like economic opportunity, some of the tougher things to think that the research hasn't quite caught up yet. But with a lot of these cases, with both neo-Nazi groups and incels, you see high levels of histories of bullying, histories of mental health, histories of broken homes and broken relationships with fathers. And we haven't really, I don't think the research has really caught up yet to where it needs to be on those questions. But there definitely is absolutely strong overlap. And this is part of what social media has done. It's created these forums where ideas can float in and out very easily. And an individual can kind of pop in and take what he needs from that. So yeah, overlap is for sure strong. And it's challenged a lot of the conceptualizations that we thought that we had.
Thanks, Jacob. Look, there's a couple of more questions coming. I'm going to ask them together because they very much relate to the same thing. First of all, we're conscious of the amount of money that's spent on counterterrorism, countering violent extremism, often disproportionate to the problem of domestic violence. What are the crossovers between, if you like, sort of regular male misogyny, including violent misogyny and domestic violence, and this particular kind of violence we're talking about here? And secondly, distinctly, but it links as well, I'm sure, Karen Holmes has a question about the creep of incel and gender-based extremism into Islamist extremism. You know, what are you observing there? Are people sort of borrowing, copying, or are they simply are we simply now paying attention to things that were always there and we hadn't given names to before? Jacob, do you want to start off?
No, those are questions for Josh, I think.
Oh, okay, right. These pass them to the too hard basket.
No, I can jump onto both of those. I think again, I've talked about it being embedded in wider society, and I didn't have time to adequately dig into that. But I mean, look, the chances are men who dislike women and have a violent ideology that talks about subordination of women, there's a good chance that they view violence towards women in the home as acceptable in some capacity. But what I'm really keen to emphasise here, this is public sphere focus. It's about changing the world in line with their ideological orientation. We're talking here about the time that they dedicate to it, the focus, and most importantly, the activities that they undertake. For example, the March for Men, which occurred in Melbourne and Sydney and was taking off before the COVID lockdowns. COVID's had one or two decent side effects, and that was one of them. It prevented that. The Conference for Men's Issues, same deal. That was meant to be held in Sydney last year, but it's been held in Chicago, it's been held in London, and you get a broad coalition of anti-women actors coming together to talk about a political agenda and so on. So I'd say that it's about the way that they're gathering and they're actually engaging in political activity to seek to enact their view of the world. So that's the difference between that and domestic violence. And I want to differentiate, because that world of domestic violence isn't something I'm an expert in, but I also don't want to underdo the incredible work that has been done by feminist scholars in that space. So I want to leave that distinction there. The other dimension on the, I suppose, the incel, gender-based extremism and Islamist extremism. I mean, yeah, I've done work on Deakin and Ware and looked at their framing of women, and I think, look, ultimately there are a lot of similarities. Women belong in the home. Western women are licentious and dirty, and good Muslim women give birth to lots of future warriors, cubs of the caliphate, and so on. But I also see a significant difference, and this is based on work we did for the Department of Justice in Victoria, in the way that Islamist civil society organisations frame it. There's a self-assuredness. They don't even need to address that women, I suppose, secondary, like, belong in the private sphere in their framing. They don't even talk about it publicly. It's just sort of exhumed. Whereas what we see with these other groups is that they're very outspoken about that and the need for that. And right-wing and far-right actors get away with a level of language, hatred and hostility in the public space that far exceeds anything Islamist actors have ever gotten away with, without scrutiny and without the state surveillance following. So I think that's probably critically important. Can I just jump on Adrian? Oh, sorry, I'm not meant to mention names. Can I just jump on that question? that just came through, and then hand over to Jacob. Just that, are there women that support these views? Absolutely. They frame themselves as trad wives, or women who are quite happy to belong in the home. And there are certainly some really excellent research being done in that space by other scholars. But I'm not an expert on why women are following and aligning with it. I'm particularly interested in men and why men are seeking to enact this. Over, Jacob.
Sure, I'm not sure how helpful I can be on the first two questions. The third one that Josh just mentioned, there is one piece in particular I'm thinking of that again, this is not something I'm an expert on at all, but there was a piece in ICCT, The Hague, believe early 2020 by Renske van der Veer, where she talked about trying to fight back against research that only painted incels as or the incel phenomenon as being something that men could subscribe to. So there has been a push within, with some researchers to try and look beyond just men incels and look at women. One thing on the first question, on the second question about Islamist terrorism. Since 9/11, which obviously involved a very international terrorist attack that targeted hard targets, we've seen a shifting in large part due to international counterterrorism efforts towards homegrown terrorism. And if we get away from the ideological question of why people are doing this, you start to see a lot of similarities and profiles across ideologies. So whether somebody's an incel, or whether they're a far-right extremist, or whether they're a Salafi jihadist, you see a lot of similarities, like in the Western world, in Europe and the US, and probably Australia too. Like, they're radicalized online. They are young men. They attack soft targets, typically in the countries they're actually from. They use crude weaponry in most cases. So the personal factors and the kind of the terrorist MO tend to be pretty similar across a lot of ideologies. Now, whether there's ideological similarities, I think that's a far better question for Josh. But there was some good research done, for example, on the similarities between the Christchurch shooter and the Orlando shooter in Florida, who was an ISIS-inspired gunman who attacked a nightclub in Florida. So the stories behind those two incidents were pretty similar, even though the ideologies were perhaps diverging.
Great, thanks, Jake. And there's a question that's come through specifically with your name on it, so I'm going to handball it to you. And it's asking this question, if not all incel violence is clearly terrorism, some of it clearly does seem to be involved with a larger extremist narrative pushing for political change and therefore fits the definition of terrorism. Either way, how useful is it for us to respond to incel violence or the potential for incel violence as terrorism? Does that cause more problems than it solves? Or should we approach incels in a completely different way?
Well, look, I'll answer in two parts. I think, first of all, the question of whether it does more harm than good is, that's the $1 million question, right? And nobody knows. I mean, you would give attention to these things. You would give it an element of, taboo. Those are the parts that might make it more dangerous. But here's the thing: I can't speak for the Australian case, but I can speak for the US case. In the US, we do not have equality in our terrorism sentencing right now. A would-be ISIS fighter who was arrested planning to join the Islamic State in the US would get a material support to a foreign terrorist organization charge and get probably about 10 years of average, 10 years on average. A guy who is caught plotting a far right or incel attack, he's going to get a gun charge, maybe a drug charge, and he's going to get a couple of years. And that's just not, A, it's not enough, B, it's not right. Right now we're treating different ideologies differently, and often that comes down ultimately to the color of the attacker's skin, and that's not a long-term solution. So right now we need to do something about trying to level out the prosecutions that we have available to us in the US on terrorism cases. The flip side of that is we need other stuff anyway. we need a more robust CVE strategy to deal with all ideologies. So, the answer is not a terrorism prosecution of an American-based incel. The answer is trying to figure out why we're losing young, angry, sometimes vulnerable men to angry chat rooms. So it's a question of doing both and trying to find a way to, have better means to stop the imminent, immediate threats, while also thinking long-term about how to push back against some of these nefarious, angry movements.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Jacob. Just can I draw you out on one sort of sub-point of explanation? Incels almost invariably are linked, if they are seen as being terrorist, with domestic terrorism and not with international terrorism, and US law treats people who have links with international organizations, groups like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, very differently than people who are involved with purely domestic groups. Is that the only problem going on with incel terrorism and the way we define it? I mean, is it, in other words, is it part of this bigger problem of not properly addressing domestic terrorism and having the legislative means to deal with it?
Well, I'd say that's the imminent problem that we face writ large. Is exactly as you say. You can charge a terrorist or a would-be terrorist who's kind of flirting with a movement, even giving money, even sending hot chocolate to a foreign terrorist organization. You can give him or her a foreign terrorist organization, material support to a foreign terrorist organization charge. We have nothing on that front on the domestic stage. So that's the difference. I think the other big challenge we have, and I discussed this in my remarks, is sometimes it's really hard to tell with incels and male supremacists how much kind of where the personal grievances stop and where the ideological ones start. And a terrorism charge needs to be reserved for those ideological cases. Elliot Rodger, Isla Vista, California, the original incel, definitely an ideological terrorist. Alec Manassian, the Toronto van attacker, definitely an ideological terrorist. But then you have cases like, for example, Nicholas Cruz, the Parkland school shooter, the gunman who killed 17 children at that high school on Valentine's Day. The Valentine's Day part 2018, that's a bit of a red flag. He'd mentioned incels online before, but we just didn't have there's no manifesto, there's no public statement, there's nothing about those victims that says incel. So it's very difficult to know in a case like that how much it's an ideological question, how much is a personal question. And there, the terrorism charge really shouldn't be used writ large. So it makes no difference in those cases. So depends on the case.
Yeah, that's a really good point and helpful point. Just because somebody does something really bad isn't an argument for using the label terrorist, because if we start applying terrorist to everything we don't like, it's going to undermine the whole utility of that instrument. Just finally, Josh, when somebody is involved in male supremacism and white supremacism, where those two things align, I take it from what you're saying, it's the terrorist connection is much more clear cut, and the potential for terrorist violence is also very clear.
Yeah, I'd say it's certainly a red flag, so to speak. That if you see that alignment of hatred of women and those powerful views combined with that ethno-nationalism or far-right extremism in some capacity, it's not just a viewpoint, it's a way of life. These people are living and seeking to change the world around them. And I suppose you see that in you've only got to look at who's in prison or facing charges in Australia for far-right extremism to see that it becomes a way of life. They live in gangs or tribes. They separate off from society, and obviously they become an extreme threat. So that's probably where I'd say is critical, is that whilst male supremacists are out there, it's the extent to which they're prepared to radicalise the violent extremism and how we actually identify that's critical. And that's probably the next step of research, to be honest, as well.
Thanks very much, Josh. Thanks, Josh, and thank you, Jacob. You've both been brilliant. Thank you for being up late for us, Jacob. Look forward to having you again. If there's one thing this pandemic has given us, it's Zoom. And I don't say that facetiously. I mean, the chance to connect with colleagues internationally. I look forward to getting on a plane and meeting you face to face and having you and other colleagues come and visit us here. But short of that, we've got no excuses now not to meet more regularly via this medium as well. So it's been really great to make this connection. We're going to take a 10-minute break, and then we're going to the far right again, further into the far right, with a couple of panels unpacking various aspects of that for the remainder of today. Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Jacob, and look forward to hearing more from both of you about this topic. Sad though it is.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.